Please.
Michael Makovsky, I'm President and CEO of JINSA, the Jewish Institute of National Security of America.
Okay.
We support a strong U.S. military, strong national security, and we believe that a strong U.S. Israel security relationship is important for U.S. security. And we have education programs and policy work that involve U.S. and Israeli military folks.
Okay. To what extent do retired military get to advise current military in a way that they're believed to be able to say things that they couldn't when they were involved in the institution?
So one of our education programs involves bringing retired American generals and admirals to Israel, and a lot of them get involved then in our policy work and op-eds and so on. And why they're so important to involve is because the U.S. military is one of the only national institutions that Americans actually favor anymore. Their approval ratings are in the 70s, while I think Congress is like 10% and the media about that and so on. So they're usually like 3 or 4 star generals, so they've been in the military 35, 40 years. When they speak very authoritatively. People respect what they have to say, and they know a lot of things that non-military people do not. So a lot of our policy projects that usually relate to the Middle East, such as in Iran or in Turkey or the U.S. Israel security relationship, involve retired U.S. military generals and admirals.
Now that the Obama ideology has been replaced by the Trump ideology, is there still like a deep state lagging on to the way that they were groomed to accept the JCPOA that makes it difficult to make changes today?
Well, I think probably the foreign policy bureaucracy, I don't know, but I suspect was not in favor of withdrawing from the JCPOA. I think it was a very good thing, and whether they like it or not, the president withdrew from it. So the president directs U.S. foreign policy and has a lot of influence. So he's the one who sets the agenda, who sets the policy. So he withdrew. The bureaucracy needs to follow what the president does.
Yeah. So there was concern that there wasn't enough inspectability under the JCPOA. And now that we've withdrawn, people are saying, well, now we're in much worse shape. What do you think?
No, first of all, the inspections, which are done which are done by a UN entity, the IAEA, and not necessarily a fault of their own, but the Iranians were denying them entry to a number of, some important facilities in Iran. They're suspected of being involved in the nuclear weapons program. That was under the JCPOA. And you could see a big difference of what the IAEA was reporting following the JCPOA, which is like 5 or 6 pages, versus what they were reporting before, which was like 20, 25 pages. We had a lot more information before the JCPOA, I think, than we did after.
But now, is everything being built underground, that there are things that are not inspectable, even if sanctions would bring them to the table? Can they still be trusted at this stage?
I wouldn't trust them whatsoever. I think if you had a new deal, which I've actually explained, I would not conduct negotiations with them on their nuclear program unless they were fully committed to actually dismantling it, like Gaddafi did with Libya. But if we did have negotiations, there would have to be a better mechanism that would really involve anywhere, anytime inspections. That's not what you have now under the JCPOA.
Right. What did the panelists here present to the audience?
I could speak more for myself, but my view is the goal of the administration of the United States should be regime collapse. I think is our overwhelming goal. I think the administration has been very clear in their goals about the nuclear program, which is that they can't have a nuclear weapon. Pompeo has talked about nuclear weapons, denying them nuclear weapons capability, but generally they've been which I think is the better goal. But I think generally they've been pretty consistent. I think where they've been have a more muddled policy when it has to do with the Iranian regional threat, and it's essentially containment, which is basically a status quo approach to Iran. And I think that we need to roll them back, whether through direct action or supporting like the Israelis or the Kurds that could help do that. We need to roll back, raise the cost of the regional expansion, and our ultimate goal needs to be regime collapse. Not regime change, not an Iraq-style invasion, but raising the pressure in different ways to help hasten the regime's collapse.
If you were to take, as in 2009 was demonstrated, you had protesters and Bajan, what do they call them, Bajin? The Bazjins, the secret thugs. Yeah,
Basij. Yeah, the Basij.
Yeah. And even now, there are people who were shot. I mean, this is a ruthless regime. What kind of a coup could you see occurring?
By the way, I'm not advocating that the United States should be involved in a coup. I mean, if we could, that would be interesting. But you're right. This is a regime that continues to kill its own people. And as long as they're willing to kill their own people, I think that they're not going to be going anywhere so quickly, unfortunately.
You mean that the regime won't be going anywhere so quickly?
No, I don't think the regime. Look, there's clearly tremendous discontent in Iran. This preceded the Trump administration. The demonstrations by more working-class Iranians started already in the winter when Trump took office. The sanctions that Trump has imposed, which I commend, have only intensified their pressure. The regime makes its own mistakes, having nothing to do with the United States. Shooting down a Ukrainian airliner, lying about the coronavirus. They're causing problems for themselves, having nothing to do with sanctions. Our sanctions are only intensifying it. But as long as they're willing to keep killing their people, which they seem to be, unfortunately, I don't think they're going away so quickly.
General Mattis was against military action against Iran. What would happen if in November 2020 that the Democrats take over?
I think it would be, depends which Democrat, of course, but let's just say it's Bernie Sanders, or it could be Biden, obviously, or Bloomberg, I guess, or based on current polls. I think it depends. If a Democratic president says, I'm going to get back into the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, I think that'd be an utter disaster, because a lot of the restrictions of the deal, it'd be better for them to say, let's negotiate a new deal than get into the old deal, because the old deal, a lot of the restrictions on their nuclear program are going to start kicking in, including on advanced R&D on their nuclear program. That's in a few years. So I think that'd be very dangerous if any Democratic administration. I think probably the Iranians would be very emboldened by a Democratic administration now, given that Trump has been relatively tough, and they'd probably increase their aggression, and they probably expect that sanctions will be lightened. That's what one would hope. That's what one would expect. Certainly if Bernie Sanders is president, a guy who seemed to apologize about the Iranians in the late 70s when they were holding our folks hostage, I think that would be a particularly boon to the Iranians, and very depressing, I think, also for the Iranian people. I think they need to see a U.S. president that stands with them, which I think this president, Trump, has. This is a nonpartisan statement. I think he was a little slow to it, but I think he has been. If they see a president, a Democratic president, who seems willing to work with the regime and not confront it as much, I think that's going to undercut the demonstrations in Iran and will also dishearten our Arab and Israeli allies in the region.
What would that how would that bode for Israel against this threat that they have coming from Syria and through Gaza?
Well, it depends which Democrat. Again, I think if it's Bloomberg, he'll probably be more sympathetic. Biden, somewhat on that score. Sanders, not. Based on what we know today. So I think the Israelis, if a Democratic administration follows the Trump administration policy of supporting Israel on its activities in Syria and so on, that would help. What's really important, I think, also for Israel and for our efforts on Iran is the United States shows that we're close to the Israelis, that we're with them. If we distance ourselves from the Israelis, it only helps the Iranians. And by the way, that's one of the reasons my organization has been pushing a mutual defense pact with Israel as an added layer of deterrence for Israel, as a way to mitigate any consequence of a serious war with Iran or any other major power, and could be a platform for closer cooperation. We think the closer the United States is to Israel, the worse it is for the Iranians, and not only good for Israel and its security and U.S. interests, but I think it also is a signal to our enemies and to our allies in the region. We're with Israel. That means we're with our friends in the region, and we're against our enemies.
But would that, as a mutual defense pact, assuming that it's a compact, would it require ratification from Congress?
Yes. It would require 67 votes.
And
But by the way, you have Prime Minister Netanyahu has already embraced this idea. You have Trump that has already expressed interest in this in public. The leaders have discussed it. Anyway, we'll see whether it progresses. But first you would need the administration to say, we're definitely interested. The two governments then would have to hash things out a little more. Right. My organization, JINSA, we've already written a treaty as a basis of conversation, but we imagine, if this actually progressed more intensely, there'd be, changes to that. Then it would go to the Senate.
What are the prospects that this could occur before November?
It's a good question. I honestly don't know. I think that let's see first of all what happens in the Israeli election. Certainly Netanyahu is very in favor of this. Benny Gantz has expressed some skepticism about it. There are other priorities I know the administration and the Israelis are working on having to do with the Trump peace plan. I think they want to resolve those first maybe. It's possible. It's certainly the Prime Minister Netanyahu was certainly very interested. And be clear, we proposed this first. We're very happy that these now world leaders have actually shown a lot of interest in this. It would be a narrow defense treaty. We have a mutual defense treaty with 50 other countries. This would be a more narrow one than those. We think it's good for the United States. It would add an element of stability in the region, and it would be good for Israel.
Is this something that has been embraced by AIPAC so far?
No. No one has embraced, no other organization that I'm aware of, AIPAC or others, have embraced it. They're not necessarily opposed to it either. They'll probably, my guess is they'll wait to see, if the administration actually wants to go forward with it, but this came from us, from JINSA, actually.
So I heard it first from Lindsey Graham.
That's right. I was glad you brought it up. Okay. Lindsey Graham, who Lindsey Graham is the main Senate champion. He's the biggest champion of mutual defense pact, I'd say, right now among U.S. officials. He's obviously very influential both in the Senate and with this administration. We've worked with him on it. He and I have actually written an op-ed calling for this together, and he even said in November, actually at our annual dinner, that we wrote the treaty. He made some amendments, but he said this was a legacy item for him, so I know it matters to Senator Graham. And we love working with him.
But the way that the Democrats are now trying to distance themselves from Israel in this election, do you think that the Congress people might be reticent to back it before such an election?
I think it's possible. I mean, first the administration would have to be in favor of it. But then I think it's possible. I mean, Senator Schumer, I think, would probably support it. I can't speak for him, of course, but I think you definitely would have Democrats. Yeah. If you need 67, there are 53 Republicans. You figure you're going to need at least 15 Democrats at a minimum to support this. I think it's possible. Lindsey Graham, who knows the Senate much better than I do, he feels confident it would pass, actually. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
All right, thank you very much.